the spring of 2020, during that isolating period of fever terrors and shutdowns, I moved to the woods with my children. I'd recently separated from their father, but we'd all recently separated from humanity. So to bring a little life back to my life, I decided we'd grow a garden. I bought tomato seedlings from a farmer down the road with delicious sounding names: Sun Gold, Brandywine, 5-Star Grape. The kids helped me plant them in big pots that dwarfed their little forms, and watered them and sprinkled the soil with plant food. We even put support cages around them in anticipation of what the gardening book said would be an explosion of heavy tomatoes by June. I couldn't wait to spend the summer of 2020 eating tomatoes with everything. But things did not go as planned. The plants grew nearly as tall as me, but not one flower emerged. By late June, when they should have been in full harvest, they were all extravagant green leaves and not a single tomato. I went back to see the gardener down the road. My plants seem to be barren, I said. She looked at a picture on my phone and squinted. Ignore them, she said. Don't water them for a week. They need a little stress. Stress? It had never occurred to me that any living thing would need stress, let alone to thrive. As I walked home from the store, I thought, well, this is ridiculous. I'm up here in the middle of a plague trying to grow tomatoes. I'm trying to grow something that doesn't want to grow. This is when an essay idea started to take shape in my mind, because all my life, another story has been in the faint background. My grandfather died by suicide at 42 when my mother was a child. These two things bumped against each other on the walk home. My dead grandfather, my barren tomato plants. A question was forming. What makes something want to live? I'm a writer and a writing professor, and this is how essays often start for me. A curiosity will strike, and out of that curiosity, a vague question will begin to form. I'll carry that question around with me as I go about my life, making lunches for my kids, taking the subway to teach, reading the newspaper, and then evidence to support or argue it will start to appear, like clues left at a crime scene. If I'm smart, I start jotting down notes. So when I got home from seeing the farmer that day, I sat right down at my computer to write, and I didn't stop to censor or edit. I just wrote whatever it was I was thinking on the subjects of will and propagation and hardship. I wrote about longing for a garden and about dragging those big pots around in the sun to try to catch it throughout the day. And I wrote about the few things I knew of my grandfather, including that he'd been studying Elizabethan eschatology when he died. And he was trying to write a novel. And he left my grandmother and their children very poor without him. I didn't know how any of these things were connected yet, but I just wrote whatever I could think of. Then my sister, a poet, came to visit me for the weekend. As soon as she arrived, she shut herself in my study and left me her toddler to take care of. I was a little annoyed at first being abandoned to babysit, but I knew this was important. It was part of my investigation. She was upstairs trying to produce a book of poetry. My plants were downstairs trying, or let's face it, failing, to grow tomatoes. How were these things both about that great and deep desire to make something that had never existed before? Now, the thing about writing essays is you have to trust a hunch, just enough to follow it. In this case, my hunch showed signs of life, and I wanted to keep going. I like the feeling of discovery, and the more I write, the more I chase that feeling. So the next thing I did on this essay was I went out and did some research on tomatoes. I learned that they were thought to be toxic in the 1700s, and that wealthy homes would display them all over tables to look beautiful and extravagant, but never to be eaten unless you wanted to be poisoned. I learned that some tomato varieties will grow lots of hair on their stems to withstand cold temperatures. Have you ever seen a hairy tomato? It's probably trying to stay warm. I wrote down stories and I followed each thread of connection they made, all inside of a broader articulation of what I felt I knew. We are biologically driven to make something and to propagate the earth and to steer each other from madness. The word essay, if you didn't know, comes from the French verb essayer, and it means to try. Essays are always trying to figure something out, trying to answer a question. The word personal in the term personal essay does not mean it's just about you. It means you are an essential source of knowledge, and your personal stories make great evidence for exploring a larger idea. Vivian Gornick, who is a master of the form, writes that for an essay to succeed, a subject beyond the self must be intersected with. Now, I know what you're all thinking. These days, there are so many shortcuts when we write. Our phones will finish our sentences for us. AI programs will write a whole story at the touch of a prompt. But these stories and sentences are grabbed from a massive database, like one of those claw machines at an arcade. They can only tell a story or parts of stories that have already been told in language that's already been written. These shortcuts, they really miss out on perhaps the best part of writing, which is the wonder and exhilaration of saying something new, not to mention the pleasure of reading it. The work of articulating an idea or thinking creatively and logically through an argument, contemplating those eternal questions of how to live or be or bear, that is human work. And the stories we tell from our lives are risky and vulnerable and searching. That's their power. That's why sometimes we might cry when we read a story, or laugh out loud, or dog-ear a little article to share. Now, I do admit that some aspects of translating experience into writing comes more easily for me because I grew up with writers. My grandmother was a poet, my mother a novelist. I wrote my first short story called Hot O' Cloud when I was 4 years old, and I was on the floor of my grandmother's drafty old farmhouse in Vermont. The story was about a cloud that couldn't stay formed because it was always too hot or too cold. What I was doing was what I saw everyone around me doing, using symbolism, defamiliarizing objects the way poets do. I found it magical to find something inside something else. Soon, I wanted to write all the time. But it wasn't until I was in my early 20s that I fell in love with the essay as a form. As a young poet, newly arrived in New York City for my very low-level job in book publishing. My mother had raised me on her own in Vermont with very little money, just as her mother had raised her. And so when I arrived at the Port Authority bus terminal on 42nd Street, I had one suitcase of barely acceptable work clothes for my new job. The first night I stayed in New York, I was in a rented room so tiny, I had to iron my polyester skirt on a toilet lid. That year, I discovered Vivian Gornick, and Joan Didion and Hilton Owls, writers whose essays seized my attention like an accident on a highway. I had only ever been so riveted by the interior world of a writer reading poems. But these pieces, propulsive, puncturing, found in big literary magazines, they were more expansive than poems. They were nothing like the 5-paragraph essays I'd learned to write in high school, where a dull introduction will march toward an obvious and very identical conclusion. And they were nothing like short stories either, with invented plots and sometimes unreliable narrators. These were writers associatively digging through their own lived experience, seeking some kind of clarity on a subject, but also inviting us along for the ride. The emotional and intellectual discoveries in these essays knocked me out left and right. They were as intimate as friendship and could be as jolting as a burn. Recently, one of my beloved students asked me how I recall so many stories from my life and how I remember all the details. And here's the truth: I don't. Well, I don't at first. When I started writing that essay about tomatoes, I suddenly recalled my mother and how she would cut tomatoes when I was a kid, these big fat ones, into quarters, and then she'd douse them in Italian dressing and then hand them out in bowls. That was lunch. I would sit and eat mine with a book flat in front of me on the porch, and I would copy down the words that I liked the sound of, that would over the years become a blue plastic folder of 1,000 words I wanted to use to be smarter. When writing, I have remembered all kinds of things. The rush of the river behind my aunt's house on the mountain the summer I turned 14, and my mother went away to a hospital and left me there. That memory sneaks away from me a little more each year. But if I can catch a snag of it, like a little string hanging off the memory, I can slowly stitch it back together. Oh yes, that was the sound of that rushing river the year she was gone. And that was the hot tar roof I would lay on to listen to it. And now I recall how I would sneak downstairs at night and eat dried figs off of a shelf in my aunt's kitchen, and how the only 2 friends that I had that year thought it was a weird food to like, and for reasons unrelated to figs, decided one day not to be friends with me anymore. And how cold it got on the mountain in my bedroom in the winter, and how lonely it was to be a kid. A strange thing happens when you start writing down memories. They just propagate. Memories lead to more and more memories. And then stories just stretch out for all the details you thought you'd forgotten a long time ago. But writing, it's about so much more than just recording what's on your mind. It's about bringing your whole self into the process, everything you feel and understand and perceive, your conscious and your unconscious mind. If you stick with it, you will feel something taking over your narrative like a spell. I found this amazing when I first heard it. Our conscious mind processes 40 pieces of information a second, but our unconscious mind processes around 11 million. What this means is that you are making connections without even realizing it every time you sit down to start writing. When you're under that spell, you're going to find that your idea will change a lot as you go, and you're going to have to adjust your evidence, your stories, and your associations to accommodate your subliminal vision. quick story. When I think of subliminal vision, I think of Sally Mann, that wonderful photographer who rose to fame in the 1980s for her iconic portraits of her children, very close up and sometimes in freaky positions like bleeding from the nose, half dressed, and wearing a tutu beside a dead deer. But as Mann's children got older, her camera started to move further and further away from them, as if under a spell. It was taking in more of the landscape around them. Mann says in her documentary, What Remains, that she found herself photographing her children in bigger and bigger landscapes around their family farm in Virginia, and her children were getting smaller and smaller in them. Eventually, what she was photographing were these vast images of the southern US, and not her children at all. I recently finished writing a memoir, which is like a really, really long personal essay in some ways. I thought that the subject of my memoir was my divorce, and I went along writing about the sometimes agonizing experience of detaching from your life with another person. But I found as I was writing that those stories of my marriage were shrinking, like Sally Mann's children. And what was emerging instead were these stories of my mother, and our conversations and our memories. They were overtaking that picture of the marriage I'd been in. I realized by the end that I had unwittingly created an entire portrait of a mother and daughter spanning decades, battling and metamorphosing like characters in a Greek myth against the creation of a whole new world. What I mean is, this book was a defiant tomato plant. It was growing however it wanted. And in the end, it was telling the only story that it seemed I really wanted to tell. So when you're writing a personal essay, remember that you are always, in a sense, two people. You are the lucid observer of all your memories and your experiences, and you're the grand inquisitor of the world's infinite ideas. You are the girl lying homesick on her aunt's roof, listening to the river, and you are the woman years later who remembers her.